Thank you. It's great to be here and share some thoughts on the changing face of leadership. In all sectors and at all levels, leaders today face an extraordinarily high level and pace of change. These are driven by four forces, and to respond, leaders must strike a balancing act in four areas: perspective, motivation, planning, and renewal. These balancing acts, I believe, are critical not just for the success of their teams and their organizations, but also for their own sustainability of the leaders' energies and passions. I'll share some thoughts on each of these four with some inspiration from the worlds of philosophy, politics, music, and literature. Let me frame the challenge that leaders face with two numbers and a story. The first number is 50%. 50% of the companies on the S&P 500 will disappear within 20 years. And the pace at which they disappear is accelerating.
Well, I'm not going to do a raffle anymore. So.
Past institutional greatness is no guarantee of future relevance. The second number is 40%. 40% of newly hired or promoted leaders fail in their roles within 18 months. When you think about the amount of resources and energy that go into recruiting new leaders at all levels, that is an astonishingly high number. Past experience and qualifications at an individual level offer no guarantee of future success. And here's the story. I have a good friend who's the founder of a startup, quite successful, has been around for 3 years, and I caught up with him a couple months ago. And he told me about the highlights of his day. In the morning, he said a 1-hour leadership team meeting became 3 hours because they had conflicting data on customer campaigns they were running, and they had to hash through what really made sense. He then had to deal with an emergency because his outsourced developer team in a different country was close to finalizing a deal with a startup that he considered a competitor. He then spent a couple hours in the afternoon with a consumer advocate group that was concerned about transparency and disclosure on his website and mobile app. And at the end of the day, the head of his marketing team, whom he had recruited a year ago as an indispensable leader to drive the growth of the company to the next level, quit. He said he was tired of working 20-hour days and wanted to go do something different. And I said, so you've had a bit of a day. And he said, yeah, but you know the crazy thing? This is not an unusual day for me. And this, I think, frames the challenge that leaders face today, which I believe are driven by four forces working together. And in my friend's story that I just shared with you, you see these four forces at work. Technology creates enormous opportunity, but it also creates an explosion of data. It could potentially commoditize your own business. If you're working through data generated by technology from different sources, you have to spend quite a bit of time sifting through signal and noise, as my friend did. Globalization, again, creates enormous opportunity. But as talent and capital become more mobile, competition can come from anywhere, not just from where you're located. External stakeholders, incredibly important. If you are now a leader in any organization, in business, in government, at an NGO, dealing with external stakeholders that are not your customers isn't just a job for your communications or external affairs department. It is a critical job description for you as a leader. And finally, demographics. The world's largest economies, China, Japan, the US, and Western Europe, will age considerably in the next 2 to 3 decades. And this, for many leaders, will pose challenges because growth will be harder to come by. And at the same time, the rise of an energetic millennial generation, in the US alone, 80 million people, with high expectations for their leaders, looking to their leaders for better coaching, for greater personal autonomy, for the leaders to serve as role models, not just of high achievement, but also of sustainability, increases the metabolism for leaders on 3 fronts. The pace of activity, they must do more. Change, they must change more quickly. And they must need to operate at a higher level. In response, I believe that leaders must strike 4 balancing acts. The first balancing act is one of perspective. Leaders must commit to impact in this world, but acknowledge its ultimate irrelevance. This is a quote that is sometimes attributed to Bertrand Russell and sometimes to other authors. The question, is man merely an impure lump of carbon and water crawling impotently on a meaningless planet with delusions of grandeur? Or is he a heroic being, capable of molding realities to realize grand visions? And the answer, of course, is that he's both at once. Now, stay with me on this because at first this may sound like a bit of a downer, but it's actually quite a practical tip for leaders on a daily basis. One of my friends who's a senior leader in government says that there's so much coming at him on a daily basis, he no longer thinks about having good days or bad days. He says he has good minutes and bad minutes. And he cannot respond or react to the stimuli that he's getting on a minute-by-minute basis. He's got to find a way to balance it out. And I use this as a practical tip. So for example, today, if you all like my talk and I get some compliments afterwards, I'm going to get the compliments, but then I'm going to go home and remind myself that I am merely an impure lump of carbon and water. If, on the other hand, I suck, I will remind myself that I'm still a heroic being, capable of molding realities to realize grand visions. The second balancing act is around motivation. Leaders act in a consequence-oriented world. Often, they and their people are measured and compensated based on outcomes. So it is impossible for them to ignore outcomes. But the way to motivate others and themselves, I believe, in a sustainable way, is to focus on actions and engagement. This is an observation from an Indian epic called the Gita. And the charioteer, the guy in the front, is called Krishna. He's a god incarnated on earth to destroy evil. And the Gita is an Indian epic where he gives advice. I believe this advice is quite relevant for leaders today. He observes, if you are to live, you must act. You only have the right to act. You have no right to the fruits of your actions. In other words, if you're a leader, don't just tie your self-esteem to consequences. Tie it also to the actions that you take. As an example, one great CEO I know takes the time both for herself and for her team to look at their biggest successes and their biggest failures, and then reflect on the actions they took. They then step back as a group and as individuals to say, what could we do differently? How can we act better and learn from our successes and from our failures? In the same vein, there is an observation by John Stuart Mill, who's an English philosopher. And he makes this observation in his autobiography. This is a quote from chapter 5. The title of the chapter is A Crisis in My Mental History. He's a 29-year-old trying to figure out what to do with his life, and he's unhappy. He's going through a depression, trying to figure out what he needs to do. He then comes to this life-changing realization, and I share it with you today. He says, ask yourself if you're happy, and you will cease to be so. Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness, on the happiness of others, on the improvement of mankind, followed not as a means, but as itself an ideal end. Aiming thus at something else, they find happiness by the way. In a culture that thinks so much about happiness, leaders must recognize that happiness is fundamentally a byproduct, and they must focus and motivate their teams on the larger vision, something bigger than themselves and their own happiness. The same CEO I shared the story about also begins and ends every meeting, however little it might be, with a reminder of their mission. What are we here to accomplish? Why are we having this meeting? And she closes the meeting to her teams with a reminder of the same thing. And it's a way to inspire people to remember that what they're doing on a day-to-day basis means something beyond their own happiness and contributes to the greater mission of a company or an organization. The third balancing act is around planning. Never has traditional financial or strategic planning been in so much danger as it is today. Here's an observation from John Lennon that I think is quite apt. He says, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And when we talk to leaders today, they make this observation that as soon as they complete a 3 or 5 year strategic plan, because of the pace of change and the forces that I talked about, that plan is pretty much obsolete. So they need to think about plans not just as artifacts that they then follow up on, but as more dynamic living entities. And several great leaders are doing this today. A chief marketing officer I know coaches his teams when they come to him and say, we need more information before we launch a campaign. He says, don't go do more analysis, actually launch some tests with what you already know and use the feedback from those tests to adapt and shape what you're going to do. But at the same time, while planning has limits, you do have to plan as a leader to replace yourself. This is an observation from Charles de Gaulle. He says, the graves are full of indispensable men. And I think that's worth thinking about for a second. We live in the age of talent. Great, talented people are in demand, and many leaders are talented people. But the pace at which talent is mobile today means that leaders need to not be hostage to good talent, including themselves. If you are a leader, you must have a thoughtful succession plan, not just for yourself, but for everybody on your team. And you must mobilize both internally and in connecting with your external networks to replace anybody who might leave. The final balancing act is around renewal. Be true to yourself, but have the courage to change. Perhaps the most important of the four balancing acts for the personal sustainability and relevance of leaders. James March, who's a professor emeritus at Stanford, makes this observation about Don Quixote, who is a knight-errant and is widely regarded as foolish because he tilts at windmills. When challenged to explain his behavior, Quixote does not justify it in terms of calculations and expected consequences. Rather, he says, Yo sé quién soy. I know who I am. March proceeds to observe, Quixote reminds us that if we trust only when trust is warranted, if we love only when love is returned, if we learn only when learning is valuable, we lose an essential part of our humanity, our ability to act in the name of a conception of ourselves, regardless of consequences. The age of the inaccessible authoritarian leader who commanded respect simply because of title and position is over. Leaders today need to be authentic because the mere smell of the lack of a core will cause people to vote with their feet and move away from the leader. Leaders must be completely clear who they are, what they stand for, and what they will not tolerate. At the same time, outside of that core, leaders must have the courage to change. Here's a quote from Victor Hugo in Les Miserables. He notes that all sublime conquests are more or less the rewards of courage. To dare, progress comes at this price. To strive, to brave all risks, to persist, to persevere, to grapple hand to hand with destiny, at one time to confront unjust power, at another to defy drunken triumph. Such is the example nations need and the light that electrifies them. For leaders who seek to electrify nations today, this is apt advice. One CEO I know likes to say, the bottleneck is usually at the top, which means he recognizes that he himself is often the biggest obstacle to change. Not only do his people need to change, he needs to change. And the way he lives this is every Sunday evening he takes 30 minutes in quiet solitude to reflect on the week before and the week ahead, and he commits to one thing he will do differently, one change he will make. And it's a personal commitment to remind himself to have the courage to change. So 4 balancing acts for leaders in a changing world. Perspective. Commit to impact in this world, but remember its ultimate irrelevance. Use it to motivate yourself day to day when the world gives you positive or negative feedback. Motivation. Mobilize yourself and your teams to deliver outcomes as you must, but with a focus on actions and engagement first to sustain the motivation of your people. Planning. Don't overplan and recognize that plans need to adapt, but do plan in a structured way to replace yourself and key members of your team. And finally, renewal. Be true to yourself and communicate that to your people, but have the courage to change. Thank you.